Beloved brothers and sisters, today I ask you not to close your heart too quickly, because what you are about to hear may shake something you have held for a very long time. Sometimes the greatest danger to our faith is not sin outside the church, but traditions inside the church that we have never dared to question. We love God sincerely, we serve faithfully, yet we may unknowingly carry burdens that God never placed on our shoulders. Many people live their spiritual lives under silent fear, fear of lack, fear of curses, fear that if they do not give in a certain way, God will withdraw his blessing. But I ask you today, is our God a loving Father or a demanding accountant? Does he draw us by grace or drive us by threat? These are not small questions. They go to the very core of how we see God and how we walk with him every day. When truth is mixed with fear, it becomes a heavy chain. When obedience is separated from love, it becomes slavery. God never intended his children to live under pressure, guilt, or manipulation. He intended us to live by faith, free, joyful, and led by the Spirit. Yet many sincere believers are exhausted, confused, and wounded, because what they were taught to honor God has slowly replaced intimacy with obligation. Today is not about rebellion. It is not about money. It is about truth. It is about returning to the heart of God and asking with humility, Lord, what did you truly mean? When light comes, it does not destroy faith, it purifies it. And when truth is revealed, it does not weaken the church, it strengthens it. So open your heart, lay aside fears, and let us walk together into a deeper understanding, not driven by tradition, but guided by truth, grace, and the living words. A dramatic awakening to a long-held belief does not begin with rebellion, anger, or doubt, but with a quiet and unsettling realization that something assumed to be unshakable may have been misunderstood. It often starts when a deeply sincere person, one who has loved God faithfully for years, suddenly senses an inner tension between what they have practiced and what their heart believes about the nature of God. This awakening is not comfortable. It feels like standing on familiar ground that unexpectedly begins to move beneath your feet. What once felt solid now demands to be examined, not out of disrespect, but out of an even deeper desire for truth. For many believers, long-held beliefs are not merely ideas, they are emotional and spiritual frameworks passed down through teaching, repetition, and communal reinforcement. They shape prayer life decisions and even one's sense of security with God. When such a belief is challenged, the shock is not intellectual alone, it is spiritual. It feels as though a trusted voice has been questioned, a sacred structure touched. The awakening comes when one realizes that sincerity does not automatically guarantee accuracy, and that devotion does not make a belief immune to error. This moment of awakening often arrives quietly, perhaps during personal reflections, or when a familiar teaching suddenly sounds different when heard with fresh ears. The words may be the same, but the heart hears them anew. A question arises that was never allowed before. What if this is not what God truly intended? That question alone can feel dangerous, even sinful, because tradition has taught that questioning is equal to disobedience. Yet true awakening does not come from pride, but from humility, a humility that dares to place truth above comfort. The shock intensifies when one realizes how long the belief has shaped behavior through fear rather than faith. Fear of consequences, fear of loss, fear of displeasing God. Over time, fear can disguise itself as obedience. The awakening exposes this subtle shift, revealing that what was believed to be faith-driven devotion may have been sustained by anxiety and pressure. This realization can be painful because it forces an honest look at motivations that were never consciously chosen. A dramatic awakening also confronts identity. When a belief has been held for years, it becomes part of who a person is. To question it feels like questioning oneself. Many people would rather endure spiritual discomfort than face this internal conflict. Yet awakening insists on truth, not denial. It presses the heart to ask whether God is honored more by unquestioned tradition or by a sincere pursuit of understanding. In this tension, the soul begins to separate God's voice from human systems that have spoken on his behalf. What makes this awakening shocking is not simply the possibility of being wrong, but the realization that God may be far more gracious than previously believed. When fear begins to lose its grip, a new picture of God emerges, one that feels unfamiliar yet deeply reassuring. This contrast can be overwhelming. The mind struggles to reconcile the God of obligation with the God of grace. The awakening does not instantly resolve this conflict. Instead, it creates a holy discomfort that refuses to be ignored. This moment is often accompanied by grief. Grief for the years lived under pressure, for choices made out of fear, and for the spiritual weight carried unnecessarily. Yet this grief is not destructive. It is the kind that clears the heart, making room for healing. Awakening does not mock the past. It redeems it by allowing lessons to emerge from it. The believer begins to understand that God was present even in misunderstanding, patiently waiting for growth. A dramatic awakening also exposes how deeply communal reinforcement sustains beliefs. When everyone around you believes the same thing, questioning feels isolating. Awakening can feel lonely because it often happens before others are ready to see what you see. This loneliness is part of the shocks. It tests whether one's allegiance is to truth or to acceptance. Yet in this isolation, faith matures. It shifts from borrowed conviction to personal understanding. Importantly, awakening does not mean abandoning faith. On the contrary, it often strengthens it. When a belief is examined and found wanting, what remains is not emptiness but clarity. Faith becomes less about meeting requirements and more about relationship. The believer begins to walk with God rather than perform for Him. This shift marks a profound transformation, one that could never occur without the initial shock of awakenings. The most powerful aspect of this awakening is the realization that God is not threatened by questions. Truth withstands examinations. Awakening teaches that God invites His children to grow, and growth always involves reevaluations. Long-held beliefs are not dishonored by examination, they are honored by the seriousness with which they are tested. In this process, faith becomes resilient rather than fragile. Ultimately, a dramatic awakening to a long-held belief is not the end of spiritual life, but the beginning of a deeper one. It strips away illusion, confronts fear, and opens the heart to a more authentic relationship with God. It is shocking because it overturns certainties. But it is also liberating because it replaces control with trust. What begins as discomfort slowly transforms into peace, not because everything is suddenly clear, but because the believer learns to rest in truth rather than tradition and to walk forward with humility, courage, and a renewed understanding of grace that continues to unfold within the heart. Challenging tradition without attacking faith is one of the most delicate yet necessary acts in spiritual growth. Because tradition and faith often become so closely intertwined that separating them feels like tearing something sacred. For many believers, tradition is the language through which faith was first encountered. It carries memories, authority, structure, and a sense of belonging. To question tradition can therefore feel like betrayal, not only of a system, but of God Himself. Yet true faith is not fragile. It does not collapse when examined. It is tradition, not faith, that often fears scrutiny. When tradition is challenged in a healthy way, the goal is not to destroy belief, but to purify it. Faith is meant to be alive, responsive, and deeply rooted in truth rather than habits. Tradition, while valuable, is static by nature. It preserves what once helped people connect to God, but it does not automatically adapt as understanding deepens. Problems arise when tradition is treated as untouchable. When questioning it is labeled as rebellion, and when loyalty to a system is confused with loyalty to God. Challenging tradition without attacking faith requires a posture of humility. It acknowledges that those who came before acted with sincerity and conviction, even if some conclusions were incomplete or shaped by their contexts. This approach refuses to mock the past or dismiss it arrogantly. Instead, it honors intention while still allowing room for corrections. Faith matures when it learns to say, "We were faithful with what we knew then, and now we are responsible for what we are learning now." One of the great dangers in spiritual communities is equating unity with uniformity. When everyone is expected to believe, speak, and practice the same way without question, faith becomes performative rather than personal. Challenging tradition gently disrupts this false unity and invites authenticity. It gives believers permission to think, pray, and wrestle honestly without fear of being labeled disloyal. This kind of challenge does not weaken faith communities. It strengthens them by grounding them in truth rather than fear. Attacking faith seeks to dismantle belief itself, often with cynicism or contempt. Challenging tradition, however, operates from love for God, for people, and for truths. The difference lies in motivation. When someone challenges tradition because they desire a clearer understanding of God's heart, their questions are acts of devotion, not defiance. Faith is not dishonored by sincere inquiry. It is dishonored when it is reduced to unquestioned repetition. Another important aspect of this process is recognizing that faith existed before many traditions and will exist after them. Faith is relational at its core. It is about trust, surrender, and transformation. Tradition is a container, not the substance. Containers are useful, but they are not eternal. When a container cracks, the answer is not to abandon the substance, but to find a better vessel that can carry it faithfully. Challenging tradition is often the moment when believers realize they have been protecting the container at the expense of the treasure inside. This distinction also protects believers from becoming defensive. When faith is confused with tradition, any challenge feels like an attack, and defensiveness replaces discernment. People stop listening and start reacting. By separating faith from tradition, believers can evaluate ideas calmly, without fear that their entire spiritual foundation is under threat. This creates space for dialogue rather than division, growth rather than fracture. Challenging tradition without attacking faith also requires careful language and tone. Words matter. Harshness creates walls, while gentleness opens doors. Truth spoken without love may be accurate, but it is rarely transformative. When tradition is questioned respectfully, it invites others to reflect rather than resist. It allows conversations to unfold instead of conflicts to erupt. This does not mean avoiding clarity or convictions. It means expressing them with grace. Many believers fear that questioning tradition will lead to moral chaos or spiritual drift. In reality, unexamined tradition is far more dangerous. When people follow practices they do not understand, faith becomes shallow. When those practices eventually collapse under scrutiny, faith collapses with them, not because faith was flawed, but because it was never allowed to stand on its own. Challenging tradition early prevents this crisis later by anchoring belief in understanding rather than habit. This process also restores personal responsibility in faith. Instead of outsourcing spiritual thinking to authority figures or inherited systems, believers learn to engage actively with what they believe. This does not reject guidance or community, it deepens it. A community of thinking believers is stronger than a community of silent followers. Faith flourishes when people own their convictions rather than merely inheriting them. At its heart, challenging tradition without attacking faith is an act of trust in God's truth. It assumes that truth does not need protection through suppression. It trusts that God is patient with questions and secure enough to withstand examinations. This kind of challenge moves faith from dependency on external validation to confidence rooted in understandings. It replaces fear of being wrong with courage to seek what is right. When tradition is rightly challenged, faith emerges clearer, lighter, and more resilient. It becomes less about defending systems and more about knowing God. The believer is no longer trapped between loyalty and honesty, but discovers that true loyalty to God requires honesty. This realization frees the heart from false guilt and invites a deeper, more authentic walk, one where faith is not inherited blindly, but embraced consciously, joyfully, and with a growing sense of peace that continues to unfold within the soul. Distinguishing divine truth from human teaching is one of the most critical and transformative moments in a believer's spiritual journey, because it reshapes how authority, obedience, and faith itself are understood. Many people grow up assuming that anything taught from a sacred platform automatically carries divine weight. Over time, repetition turns interpretation into perceived truth, and perceived truth becomes unquestionable reality. Yet divine truth does not depend on volume, position, or tradition to be true. It stands on its own, quietly consistent, even when surrounded by layers of human explanation and institutional reinforcement. Human teaching often begins with sincere intentions. Leaders teach what they have learned, what they were taught, and what worked within their own spiritual framework. Over time, these teachings can solidify into systems, formulas, and expectations. Once embedded in structure, they gain authority not because they are unquestionably true, but because they are familiar and widely accepted. The danger arises when believers stop asking whether a teaching reflects the heart of God and instead ask only whether it aligns with what they have always heard. At that point, loyalty shifts from truth to tradition without anyone consciously choosing it. Divine truth has a distinct character. It produces clarity rather than confusion, freedom rather than fear, conviction rather than pressure. Human teachings, when disconnected from divine truth, often relies on control to sustain itself. It warns, threatens, and motivates through anxiety rather than transformation. Distinguishing between the two requires spiritual sensitivity, because human teaching can sound convincing, authoritative, and even passionate while still missing the essence of divine intent. Not everything spoken with confidence carries truth, and not every truth is spoken loudly. One of the clearest indicators of divine truth is its consistency with the nature of God. Divine truth reflects who God is, not what humans want him to enforce. When a teaching portrays God as primarily transactional, conditional, or easily offended, it deserves careful examination. Human teaching often projects human tendencies onto God, reshaping him into an enforcer of systems rather than a source of life. Divine truth, however, reveals God as relational, purposeful, and intentional in leading people toward growth rather than compliance. This distinction becomes difficult because many believers have been taught to equate submission with silence. Questioning is framed as disobedience, and discernment is confused with doubt. In such environments, human teaching is protected from evaluation, while divine truth is assumed rather than explored. Yet discernment is not rebellion. It is responsibility. Distinguishing divine truths from human teaching requires the courage to examine what has been received without assuming that examination itself is wrong. Truth welcomes light. Only error demands darkness. Human teaching often simplifies complex spiritual realities into manageable rules. This provides comfort and structure, but it can also reduce faith to mechanics. Divine truth resists reduction. It invites relationships, discernment, and growth over time. When a teaching claims to explain God fully, control outcomes, or guarantee results through rigid formulas, it is likely leaning more on human logic than divine wisdom. Divine truth does not offer shortcuts, it offers transformation. Another challenge lies in emotional attachment. Teachings received during formative spiritual seasons often carry emotional weights. They may be tied to moments of breakthrough, belonging, or personal change. Questioning such teachings can feel like invalidating those experiences. But divine truth does not erase genuine encounters. It refines understanding of them. Growth does not deny the past. It reinterprets it with greater clarity. Distinguishing truth from teaching allows believers to honor what was real without being bound by what was incomplete. Authority also plays a powerful role. When teachings come from respected figures, questioning them feels personal. Many people fear that separating divine truth from human teaching means rejecting leadership entirely. In reality, healthy distinction strengthens leadership by removing the burden of infallibility. No human voice replaces divine truth. Leaders guide, but truth governs. When believers understand this, they stop placing impossible expectations on teachers and start engaging with truths directly. Divine truth produces internal alignment. It resonates deeply, not because it is convenient, but because it rings true at the core of the spirit. Human teaching often requires constant reinforcement to maintain influence. It must be repeated, emphasized, and defended. Divine truth, once understood, does not need constant protection. It stands firm even when challenged. This difference becomes apparent over time as one brings teachings into the light of reflection, prayer, and lived experience. Fear is another revealing factor. Teachings that rely heavily on fear to enforce obedience often reveal their human origins. Divine truth may convict, but it does not terrorize. Conviction draws a person closer. Fear pushes them into compliance without understanding. When fear becomes the primary motivator, discernment fades. Distinguishing truth requires recognizing when fear has replaced trust and when obligation has replaced relationship. This process is rarely instant. It unfolds gradually as layers of assumption are peeled away. It requires patience with oneself and with others who may not yet see the distinctions. Awakening to this difference can be unsettling because it removes the simplicity of unquestioned certainty. Yet what replaces it is not chaos, but depth. Faith becomes less dependent on external validation and more grounded in understanding. Ultimately, distinguishing divine truth from human teaching restores balance. It frees believers from carrying what God never asked them to bear and invites them into a faith that is alive, thoughtful, and deeply rooted. It shifts the focus from defending ideas to embodying truth, from following systems to knowing God. When this distinction becomes clear, faith is no longer driven by obligation, but sustained by understanding, and the journey forward becomes not a burden to manage, but a relationship to grow into. Emphasizing grace over fear and obligation reshapes the entire foundation of how a believer relates to God, because it moves faith from a system of pressure into a relationship of trust. Fear and obligation often enter spiritual life quietly, disguised as discipline, loyalty, or responsibility. At first, they seem helpful, even necessary, because they provide structure and motivation. Over time, however, they begin to replace love as the primary driver of obedience. When this happens, faith no longer flows from the heart, but from anxiety about consequences, and spiritual life becomes something to manage rather than something to live. Grace, by contrast, begins with who God is rather than what people must do. It assumes that God's goodness is not earned and His acceptance is not conditional. When grace is emphasized, obedience becomes a response rather than a requirement. People give, serve, and grow not because they are afraid of loss, but because they have encountered love. Fear-based faith always asks, what will happen if I fail? Grace-based faith asks, how can I respond to what I have received? This shift may seem subtle, but it transforms motivation at the deepest level. Fear creates compliance, but compliance is not transformation. A person can comply outwardly while remaining inwardly disconnected, resentful, or exhausted. Obligation keeps behavior in line, but it cannot change the heart. Grace, however, works from the inside out. It touches identity before action. When people know they are accepted, they no longer strive to prove their worth. Their actions begin to flow naturally from gratitude rather than pressure. This is why grace produces lasting change, while fear requires constant reinforcement. One of the most damaging effects of fear-based obligation is spiritual burnout. When people believe their standing with God depends on consistent performance, rest feels irresponsible and joy feels undeserved. They become trapped in cycles of guilt, always feeling they have not done enough. Even moments of devotion are overshadowed by anxiety about what remains undone. Grace interrupts this cycle by declaring that worth is not measured by output. It restores rest as a spiritual act rather than a spiritual failure. Fear also distorts the image of God. Under fear and obligation, God is often perceived as easily disappointed, constantly evaluating, and quick to withdraw favor. This perception may not be spoken openly, but it shapes behavior subtly and powerfully. People approach God cautiously, measuring words and actions, afraid of crossing invisible lines. Grace reveals a different picture, one of patience, intentionality, and commitment to growth rather than punishment. When this image takes root, intimacy replaces distance. Obligation narrows faith into a transaction. Do this, receive that. Fail here, lose there. Over time, this transactional mindset reduces spiritual life to a checklist. People begin to measure faithfulness by visible actions alone, while internal health is neglected. Grace expands faith beyond transaction into relationship. It allows space for questions, weakness, and process. It acknowledges that growth is not linear and that mistakes do not cancel belongings. Another consequence of fear-driven obligation is comparison. When people feel compelled to meet standards, they inevitably compare themselves to others to measure success. This breeds pride in those who feel they are doing well and shame in those who feel they are not. Grace removes the need for comparison by grounding identity in something unchanging. When worth is secure, comparison loses its power, and community becomes a place of support rather than competition. Emphasizing grace does not eliminate responsibility, it redefines it. Responsibility under fear is about avoiding punishment. Responsibility under grace is about stewarding what has been given. Grace does not say actions do not matter, it says they matter for different reasons. Instead of acting to earn approval, people act because they already belong. This creates sincerity rather than performance, depth rather than display. Fear-based obligation also suppresses honesty. When people believe that admitting struggle will result in judgment or rejection, they hide. This leads to superficial spirituality, where appearances matter more than truth. Grace creates safety for honesty. It invites people to bring their whole selves, not just their polished parts. In such an environment, healing becomes possible because nothing needs to be concealed. Many people resist grace because they fear it will lead to complacency. They worry that without pressure, discipline will disappear. In reality, grace does not remove desire for growth, it purifies it. When people are free from fear, they often pursue growth more passionately, not less. They are no longer distracted by self-protection and can focus on transformation. Grace fuels commitment by aligning it with love rather than anxiety. Emphasizing grace also restores joy to spiritual life. Joy cannot thrive where fear dominates. Obligation may produce consistency, but it rarely produces delight. Grace reconnects faith with joy by removing the constant sense of threat. It allows people to celebrate progress rather than obsess over shortcomings. This joy is not shallow optimism, it is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing one is held even while growing. Ultimately, choosing grace over fear is an act of trust. It trusts that God is more interested in relationship than regulation, more committed to restoration than control. It trusts that love is a stronger motivator than fear and that truth does not require coercion to be effective. When grace is emphasized, faith becomes lighter without becoming shallow, freer without becoming careless, and deeper without becoming burdensome, inviting the believer into a way of living that is sustained not by pressure, but by love that continues to shape the heart and mind as the journey unfolds. Calling believers to spiritual maturity is an invitation to move beyond surface level faith into a life shaped by understanding, responsibility, and intentional growth. Spiritual maturity is not about age, years of attendance, or the ability to repeat familiar language. It is about discernment, stability, and the willingness to take ownership of one's spiritual journey. Many people remain spiritually dependent for years, not because they lack sincerity, but because they were never encouraged to grow beyond being told what to think and what to do. Calling believers to maturity gently but firmly challenges this dependency and invites them into a deeper, more grounded faith. Spiritual immaturity often expresses itself through passivity. People wait to be instructed, corrected, motivated, or reassured. Their faith rises and falls based on external voices, emotional environments, or the approval of others. In such a state, beliefs are inherited rather than examined, and convictions are borrowed rather than formed. Calling believers to maturity disrupts this pattern by reminding them that faith is not meant to be lived on borrowed understandings. Growth requires engagement, reflection, and the courage to wrestle with truth personally rather than relying entirely on others to do the thinking. Maturity also involves learning to handle complexity. Immature faith prefers simple answers, rigid formulas, and clear guarantees. It is uncomfortable with tension, ambiguity, or unanswered questions. Spiritual maturity accepts that growth often involves uncertainty, and that not every issue fits neatly into a fixed structure. This does not weaken faith, it deepens it. When believers mature, they learn to trust God, even when understanding is incomplete, rather than demanding certainty before obedience. Another hallmark of spiritual maturity is responsibility. Mature believers recognize that they are accountable for how they interpret, apply, and live out what they believe. They no longer blame leaders, systems, or circumstances for their spiritual condition. This does not mean rejecting guidance or community, but it means understanding that guidance cannot replace personal responsibility. Faith matures when believers stop outsourcing their spiritual lives and begin actively participating in them. Calling believers to maturity also involves shifting motivation. Immature faith is often driven by reward and punishment. People act to gain approval or avoid consequences. Mature faith is driven by values and understandings. Actions flow from conviction rather than fear. This shift changes the quality of obedience. What was once forced becomes voluntary. What was once burdensome becomes meaningful. Mature believers do not need constant pressure to remain faithful because their commitment is rooted in understanding, not anxiety. Spiritual maturity also produces emotional stability. Immature believers are easily shaken by criticism, disagreement, or change. Their faith feels threatened when challenged because it has not been tested deeply. Mature believers can listen without panic, evaluate without defensiveness, and disagree without hostility. They are secure enough to admit uncertainty and humble enough to learn. This stability strengthens both personal faith and community health. Growth into maturity requires unlearning as much as learning. Many believers carry assumptions they have never examined. Some of these assumptions were helpful at one stage, but become limiting later. Calling believers to maturity invites them to release what no longer serves growth, without condemning the season in which it once helped. Maturity honors the past without being imprisoned by it. It understands that growth means change, and change does not equal betrayal. Another dimension of maturity is discernment. Mature believers learn to distinguish between essential truth and secondary opinions, between core convictions and personal preferences. This discernment prevents unnecessary conflict and allows unity without uniformity. Immature faith often reacts strongly to differences because it feels threatened by them. Mature faith understands that not every difference is dangerous and that diversity does not undermine truth. Calling believers to maturity also challenges emotional dependency on spiritual environments. Some people rely on gatherings, music, or atmosphere to sustain faith. When these are absent, their spiritual life weakens. Maturity involves developing a faith that remains steady regardless of environments. It learns to draw strength from internal conviction rather than external stimulation. This does not diminish the value of community. It enhances it by making participation intentional rather than necessary for survival. Mature faith also reshapes how believers handle failures. Immature believers often swing between shame and denial when they fall short. They either condemn themselves excessively or justify their behavior. Mature believers respond differently. They take responsibility without losing hope. They learn from failure rather than being defined by it. This resilience comes from understanding identities more deeply and refusing to reduce worth to performance. Calling believers to maturity is ultimately a call to freedom. Dependence, fear, and obligation keep people spiritually small even when they are active. Maturity releases believers from constant external control and invites them into self-governed faith guided by truth and love. This freedom does not lead to carelessness. It leads to intentional living. Mature believers choose faith daily, not because they must, but because they understand why they want to. Spiritual maturity does not arrive suddenly. It develops through patience, humility, and a willingness to grow beyond comfort. Calling believers to maturity is therefore an act of respect. It treats people not as perpetual dependents, but as capable of understanding, discerning, and growing. When believers accept this call, faith becomes less about survival and more about purpose, less about rules and more about wisdom, and less about external validation and more about internal alignment that continues to shape how they live, choose, and believe as their understanding deepens over time. Questioning practices rooted in law rather than love is a pivotal step in spiritual growth because it confronts the underlying motivation behind why people do what they do in their faith. Law-based practices focus on rules, requirements, and consequences, shaping behavior through obligation and enforcement. Love-based practices, on the other hand, flow from relationship, understanding, and genuine desire. Many believers are deeply committed and sincere, yet their spiritual lives are governed more by duty than by love, often without realizing it. Questioning this dynamic does not reject discipline or structure. It seeks to uncover whether those structures are serving life or suppressing it. Practices rooted in law tend to measure faith by compliance. They ask whether a person has done what is required, followed the rule, or met the standard. This approach creates a checklist mentality where spiritual life becomes a series of obligations to fulfill rather than a relationship to nurture. Over time, people may become skilled at outward obedience while remaining inwardly disconnected. Love, however, cannot be reduced to a checklist. When love is the foundation, actions are expressions of connection rather than attempts to earn approval. One of the most subtle dangers of law-driven practice is that it can continue long after its original purpose has been forgotten. Rules are often established to guide, protect, or teach, but when they become absolute and unquestionable, they outlive their usefulness. People follow them simply because they exist, not because they still point toward truth. Questioning such practices is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of discernment. It asks whether the practice still reflects the heart of God or merely preserves control. Law emphasizes external conformity, while love emphasizes internal transformation. A law-based system is satisfied when behavior looks correct, regardless of what is happening within the heart. Love is never satisfied with appearances alone. It seeks authenticity, sincerity, and growth. When believers begin to question practices rooted in law, they often discover that their actions were driven more by fear of consequences than by love for God. This realization can be uncomfortable because it exposes motivations that were never consciously examined. Fear is the primary tool of law. Fear of punishment, fear of loss, fear it removes the need to measure worth through performance. When love is the foundation, growth becomes personal rather than competitive, and community becomes supportive rather than judgmental. Questioning practices rooted in law also challenges the idea that control equals holiness. Many systems maintain order through strict enforcement, assuming that without rigid rules, faith will collapse into chaos. Yet love produces a different kind of order, one that flows from shared values rather than imposed rules. When people understand why something matters, they do not need constant enforcement. Love creates internal alignment that law can never fully achieve. Law-based practices often resist questioning because questioning threatens control. When a rule cannot be examined, it becomes fragile rather than strong. Love welcomes questions because it has nothing to hide. Questioning is not a sign of weak faith, but of growing faith. It indicates a desire to understand rather than merely comply. When believers are allowed to ask why, they move from mechanical obedience to meaningful commitment. Another consequence of law-rooted practice is exhaustion. Keeping rules without understanding drains energy and joy. People feel pressured to maintain standards without always knowing their purpose. Love restores energy because it aligns action with desire. What is done out of love does not feel burdensome in the same way. Questioning law-based practices often reveals how much spiritual fatigue has been normalized and accepted as a sign of faithfulness. This process also restores personal agency. Law tells people what to do, love invites people to choose. When believers question practices rooted in law, they begin to reclaim responsibility for their spiritual lives. They no longer act simply because they are told to, but because they understand and agree. This does not weaken commitment, it strengthens it. Chosen obedience is always deeper than enforced obedience. Questioning does not mean discarding all structure. Love does not eliminate discipline, it reorients it. Practices grounded in love still involve commitment, sacrifice, and intentionality, but their purpose is clear. They serve growth rather than control. When believers begin to distinguish between law-driven obligation and love-driven devotion, they learn to keep what gives life and release what imposes unnecessary weight. Ultimately, questioning practices rooted in law rather than love is about returning to the heart of faith. It asks whether actions are drawing people closer to God or merely keeping them in line. It seeks to replace pressure with purpose, fear with trust, and obligation with understanding. When love becomes the foundation, practices regain meaning, faith regains joy, and obedience becomes a response rather than a requirement, allowing spiritual life to unfold with authenticity, depth, and freedom that grows stronger as understanding continues to mature. Highlighting the danger of misunderstanding God's heart addresses one of the most profound issues in spiritual life. Because what people believe about God shapes how they live, worship, give, serve, and see themselves. When God's heart is misunderstood, even sincere devotion can drift into distortion. People may obey faithfully, sacrifice generously, and speak passionately, yet be motivated by an image of God that is incomplete or inaccurate. This danger is subtle because it often hides beneath good intentions and religious language, making it difficult to recognize without intentional reflection. Many misunderstandings of God's heart arise when His character is filtered through human systems rather than encountered relationally. Over time, God can be perceived more as a force to be managed than a father to be known. People begin to believe that His primary concern is enforcement rather than transformation, compliance rather than connection. This misunderstanding reshapes faith into a performance where actions are driven by fear of displeasing God rather than love for Him. The tragedy is that people may feel close to God in activity while remaining distant from Him in relationships. When God's heart is misunderstood, fear often replaces trust. Instead of approaching God with confidence, people approach cautiously, constantly evaluating whether they have done enough or given enough. This fear-based relationship produces anxiety rather than peace. Individuals may feel spiritually insecure even while doing everything they believe is required. This insecurity is not a sign of humility. It is a sign that God has been viewed through the lens of obligation rather than grace. Another danger lies in projecting human tendencies onto God. Human authority often operates through pressure, reward, and punishment. And when these patterns are assumed to define God as, well, His nature becomes distorted. God is then seen as easily offended, quick to withdraw blessing, and constantly monitoring behavior. This projection limits spiritual growth because it conditions people to hide weakness rather than bring it honestly before God. When vulnerability feels unsafe, authenticity disappears. Misunderstanding God's heart also affects how people interpret hardship. If God is seen primarily as transactional, difficulties are assumed to be punishments or signs of failure. This creates unnecessary guilt and confusion during seasons of struggle. Instead of seeking understanding, people blame themselves excessively or question their worth. This misunderstanding turns life's challenges into spiritual accusations, eroding trust and replacing faith with self-doubts. This danger extends beyond individuals into communities. When leaders misunderstand God's heart, they may unintentionally teach fear as a motivator, believing it will produce commitment. Over time, communities can become controlled rather than nurtured, disciplined rather than developed. Participation becomes compulsory instead of voluntary, and growth becomes measured by activity rather than health. People may remain outwardly involved while inwardly disengaged, afraid to question or express uncertainty. Another consequence of misunderstanding God's heart is spiritual exhaustion. When people believe God is primarily concerned with output, rest feels irresponsible. They struggle to slow down, fearing that stopping will disappoint God. Joy becomes conditional and peace becomes rare. This exhaustion is often spiritual, not physical, and it accumulates quietly until faith feels heavy and unsustainable. The danger is that people may conclude the problem is their lack of discipline, when in reality it is a distorted view of God. Misunderstanding God's heart also limits generosity. When giving is driven by fear or obligation, it loses its meanings. Instead of being an expression of trust and gratitude, it becomes a transaction, meant to secure favor or avoid loss. This mindset robs giving of joy and replaces it with calculation. People may give consistently yet feel resentful or anxious, revealing that the heart behind the action has been shaped by misunderstanding rather than love. Perhaps the most serious danger is that misunderstanding God's heart can cause people to defend harmful ideas in His name. When actions or teachings are justified as representing God, even when they produce fear, guilt, or harm, discernment is silenced. People may endure emotional or spiritual damage because they believe resistance would be disobedience. This confusion keeps people bound to systems that God never intended to use as instruments of control. Correcting this misunderstanding does not happen instantly. It requires patience, humility, and the willingness to let go of familiar narratives. It often feels risky because releasing a distorted image of God means stepping into uncertainty before clarity emerges. Yet this process is essential for healing. As understanding deepens, fear loosens its grip and trust begins to grow. God is no longer approached as a threat to manage, but as a presence to know. When God's heart is rightly understood, obedience becomes relational rather than mechanical. People act not because they fear consequences, but because they value connections. Faith becomes lighter without becoming shallow, disciplined without becoming oppressive. Understanding God's heart restores balance by aligning belief with love rather than fear, intention with truth rather than assumptions, and devotion with freedom rather than pressure, allowing faith to be lived with sincerity, confidence, and peace that grows steadily as understanding continues to unfold. Inviting listeners into honest self-examination is one of the most powerful and unsettling movements in any spiritual journey because it turns attention inward rather than outward. Many people live their faith by evaluating others, measuring systems, or defending beliefs, yet rarely pause to examine their own hearts with sincerity. Honest self-examination is not about condemnation or self-criticism, it is about clarity. It asks individuals to step away from noise, expectations, and assumptions and to confront what truly motivates their actions, decisions, and beliefs. Self-examination becomes threatening when people fear what they might discover. It is easier to follow external rules than to explore internal motives. External compliance provides a sense of security, while internal reflection demands vulnerability. When believers are invited into honest self-examination, they are asked to move beyond appearances and ask difficult questions about why they believe what they believe and why they do what they do. This invitation disrupts comfort because it removes the ability to hide behind activity, tradition, or group identity. Many people confuse self-examination with self-judgment. They assume looking inward will expose failure, weakness, or inadequacy. As a result, they avoid it, preferring reassurance over truth. Yet, honest self-examination is not meant to shame, it is meant to heal. It reveals not only what is misaligned, but also what has been carried unnecessarily. When people examine themselves honestly, they often discover that much of their spiritual strain comes from expectations they never consciously chose. One of the greatest benefits of self-examination is that it restores personal responsibility. Instead of blaming circumstances, leaders, or systems for spiritual frustration, individuals begin to see their own participation in patterns that no longer serve them. This realization can be uncomfortable, but it is also empowering. Responsibility does not mean fault, it means ownership. When people own their inner life, they gain the ability to change it. Honest self-examination also exposes hidden motivations. Many actions that appear spiritual on the surface may be driven by fear, approval seeking, or habit rather than conviction. Without reflection, these motivations remain unchallenged. People may serve, or commit out of pressure while convincing themselves it is devotion. Self-examination gently but firmly asks whether actions are flowing from love or from obligations. This question alone can reshape faith at its core. Another important aspect of self-examination is uncovering assumptions about God. People often live according to beliefs they have never articulated. These beliefs operate beneath awareness, shaping behavior quietly. Honest reflection brings them into the light. When someone asks themselves why, they fear certain outcomes or feel constant pressure to perform. They begin to uncover what they truly believe about God's character. This process is essential because unexamined beliefs cannot be corrected, only reinforced. Self-examination also creates space for growth by normalizing imperfection. When people stop pretending to have everything together, they allow learning to begin. Growth requires honesty about current reality. Without it, faith becomes stagnant. Self-examination does not demand instant answers. It invites ongoing awareness. It teaches believers to observe their inner responses without immediately defending or suppressing them. Inviting people into this process also reduces hypocrisy. Hypocrisy thrives where self-reflection is absent. When individuals focus on correcting others while ignoring their own inner life, inconsistency becomes inevitable. Honest self-examination shifts the focus from appearance to integrity. It encourages alignment between belief, intention, and action. This alignment does not produce perfection, but it produces authenticity. Self-examination also deepens empathy. When people become aware of their own struggles, doubts, and contradictions, they become less judgmental toward others. They recognize that growth is complex and that everyone is in process. This awareness transforms community dynamics. Conversations become less about proving who is right and more about understanding where people are. Compassion grows naturally when self-awareness increases. Another important outcome of honest self-examination is freedom from self-deception. Without reflection, people can convince themselves that they are at peace when they are merely numb, or faithful when they are merely compliant. Self-examination disrupts these illusions gently. It does not accuse, it reveals. This revelation allows people to choose change consciously rather than being driven by unseen forces. Self-examination also strengthens faith by making it personal. Instead of repeating inherited language, individuals begin to articulate their own understanding. They learn to say what they believe and why they believe it. This process transforms faith from something received passively into something